Good afternoon if you're in Europe, good morning if you're in the Americas, and good evening if you're in Asia Pacific. It's quite late for you. I'd like to welcome you all to this, our first networking event for 2021, COVID-19 from Recovery to Sustainability. And with our new normal during the pandemic, switching to online, we're trialling new ways to gather, and we hope in some way that today replicates a real-life conference. My name is Alison Meston and I'm the Director of Communications with the International Science Council. Our vision is to advance science as a global public good. And today I hope we can do just that as we explore the UN's Roadmap to Recovery, and tomorrow Transformations Within Reach with our partners and ISC members, IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. For today's event, the main stage and breakout sessions will be recorded and made available in the UN Research Roadmap booth for later on. There you will also find additional information and PowerPoint presentation slides. I hope you have time to explore the online expo space after the formalities finish at the top of the hour. And I'm also sending you out a challenge. Do utilise the network opportunities after the sessions. You can randomly be paired with someone, or you can reach out to colleagues and invite them to a video discussion just like you would in a coffee break during a conference. If you have questions regarding hop-in navigation or you're having issues, please go to the live support booth in the expo area for troubleshooting. And finally, stay connected and sign up for our newsletters, which we will have links posted in the chat. So today we're going to hear from Dr. Stephen J Hoffman, the Scientific Director of the CIHR Institute of the Population and Public Health at the Canadian Institutes of Health and Research. And during the breakout sessions, we'll hear from Dr. Isvani Necker, the Director of Strategy and Partnerships at the African Academy of Sciences, and Asian Echeverria-Scudero, Executive Director of Chile's National Commission for Scientific and Technical Research. Let's get things underway with Dr. Hoffman. Questions to Stephen for the Q&A and other comments can be raised in the chat function for the main stage. Stephen, I have to say, I really love the way the UN Roadmap to Recovery was presented in an easy to read format with its 25 pillars and headlines like Quick Win, Best Buy and Game Changer. I'm looking forward to finding out more and especially about how the international science communities can use the roadmap as part of this recovery process. So it's welcome aboard and it's over to you.
Great. First, Alison, a big thank you to you and to the International Science Council for organizing this event, creating this opportunity to share a little bit about the UN Research Roadmap for the COVID-19 recovery. The International Science Council has been such a fantastic partner throughout this process, supporting the developments of the research roadmap and now its dissemination, so much appreciated. I also, just before starting, wanted to definitely recognize that this whole effort was very much initiated by the UN Deputy Secretary General with an invitation to lead this research roadmap. And that invitation then led to quite a coalition and partnership of people around the world. This research roadmap, it was developed in only 10 weeks, and I'll talk about that shortly, but it involved engaging over 270 experts, leaders from 38 research funding agencies, including leaders like Dr. Isvani Necker and Director Eisen Echeverry, who will be leading workshops right after this presentation. So just a big thank you to everyone and all the teams and people who made this possible. So if I think we're going to bring up the slides, and the first thing which I'll start when talking about this UN research roadmap for the COVID-19 recovery is very much the context in which this effort was launched. And so on the next slide, we highlight that, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a pandemic of a virus that spread around the world, irrespective of national borders, but it's also been a pandemic of inequities, resulting in massive social and economic consequences for everyone in the world, and especially for those who are already facing conditions of marginalization and who are already made more vulnerable. So for example, estimates suggest that last calendar year in 2020, 71 million people were pushed into extreme poverty. We know that at some points, around 90% of kids were out of schools. Cases of domestic violence have increased in some countries by 30%, and 60% of countries reported prison overcrowding, of course, increasing then the risk of spreading COVID-19. I flagged this slide and these statistics just as examples of how, yes, of course, this pandemic, it's a biological threat, but it also is the event that has pushed us back in terms of achieving goals that we have all decided for ourselves as a global community that we want to achieve by 2030, specifically the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And as a result, this event, it marks not only this major biological catastrophe, it's a social and economic catastrophe as well. It's a catastrophe for human development. Next slide. In terms of when this pandemic first started, there was a recognition within the United Nations that there was the need not only for a medical and public health response, but also a very urgent, rapid socioeconomic response. And so in April of 2020, the United Nations, various agencies and entities came together and developed a framework for the immediate socioeconomic response to COVID-19. This framework was intended to unite the efforts of the United Nations and ensure that the organization could deliver indeed as one system. As part of that socioeconomic recovery framework, there was the identification of 5 pillars for action where the UN could help and where all countries and all civil society and industry and other stakeholders could work to support efforts to get through this outbreak, but also get through it ideally and build a better recovery rather than going back to status quo. And those 5 areas were: first, health services and systems; second, social protection and basic services; third, economic response and recovery; the 4th pillar was on macroeconomic response and multilateral collaboration; and the 5th pillar was on social cohesion and community resilience. Next slide. Now, the thinking though was that as much as there was this need for this rapid action plan, which the United Nations adopted in April 2020, at the same time, it would be great if that action plan, and as those actions evolve, that they were informed by the best available research evidence. And indeed, even better is if later actions could be informed by learnings from earlier actions in both the response and recovery. So with that, the United Nations Deputy Secretary General invited the development of a UN research roadmap for the COVID-19 recovery. And specifically, her goal, as articulated in her mandate letter, was very much to catalyze a worldwide learning recovery effort, one where national and international strategies could be informed by rigorous scientific evidence across all the different fields of science in anticipation of and during the COVID-19 recovery period. Next slide. More specifically, the objectives of this rapid learning initiative was very much to ensure that let's leverage the best we can from science for immediate response. Let's ensure that early response efforts contribute learnings to later response efforts. Third, the intention was to bring renewed focus to the systemic issues highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic that we knew from well before, but which are being greater attention in light of this pandemic around, for example, and specifically around conditions of marginalization faced by many people in the world, resulting in a very unfair crisis on our hands. And fourth, a UN research roadmap for the COVID-19 recovery was intended to enable international scientific collaboration through having a unifying global framework. Next slide. Ultimately, to develop this roadmap, we were asked to do it in 10 weeks. The sense was that this was urgent. It was something that required the roadmap's release right away in order to get evidence at the core of the recovery, of a future recovery effort, and ensure that research funding agencies, research institutions, individual researchers and their partners could all sort of row in the same direction. But at the same time, we wanted it to be a global participatory process, one that leveraged insights and perspectives from across the world and its regions, as well as across age, gender, and diversity in its greatest forms. And so what we did is we convened 5 steering groups, which included 38 research funding agencies, representing 25 countries and regions. We engaged at least 270 experts, solicited written submissions, had virtual consultations, and did key informant interviews. And third, we commissioned 5 rapid scoping reviews, which itself built on written submissions, an enormous amount of studies, and ultimately summarized 320 individual studies, all of which informed the research roadmap as published. Next slide. Ultimately, this UN research roadmap for the COVID-19 recovery argues that the recovery period after this pandemic presents an opportunity for the kind of transformative changes that will be needed to achieve a better and brighter future as envisioned by the Sustainable Development Goals. And by that, the UN research roadmap presents a choice in a sense. Next slide. That choice is between business as usual and transformative choices. And the good news about the business as usual route, viewed on the bottom of the slide, is that we actually don't need research to inform business as usual. We can just go back to the way things were, and we don't need new knowledge for that. The downside, of course, is that the way things weren't actually that great, especially for many people in the world who were not actually able to benefit from the way that the world was organized and the way that efforts and everything was delivered. And so as a result, we previously were not making sufficient progress to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by the 2030 deadline. And so business as usual is not the best route forward. The challenge, though, with transformative changes, which of course is the better route, it's the route that would enable us to achieve a more equitable, resilient, and sustainable future. The challenge is we don't actually fully know how to implement those kind of transformative changes. And as a result, if we don't know how to do it, that's highlighting the vital role that research needs to play in informing these kind of transformative changes that would lead to a better recovery and a better future. And that means science needs to be thought of all the way through. And that's exactly what this research roadmap is all about. Where can science make the biggest impacts in order to enable those kind of transformative changes, in order to achieve the kind of better future that we all want to live in? Next slide. The final roadmap document, in summary, it highlights 25 research priorities across the 5 pillars of the UN's existing socioeconomic recovery framework. Essentially, what we did is we made use of and built upon that previous UN work that was published in April 2020, and we identified the top 5 research priorities for the recovery within each of those 5 pillars. Second is we provide a framework for understanding the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in this recovery process. And third, we hone in on and highlight 5 science strategies that will be key to addressing the full research ecosystem and ensuring that science can be a powerful lever in informing a better recovery. Next slide. So overall, it was 25 research priorities that are highlighted in this document, but they all together, the unifying question from all of them was singular. Next slide. The unifying question is, how can the socioeconomic recovery efforts that will be taken all around the world during and after this outbreak, how can they be purposefully designed to stimulate equity, resilience, and sustainability all at the same time, as well as progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals? Essentially, we know that there's going to be unprecedented actions, policies, and programs happening both during and after this pandemic. How do we make sure that those programs and policies, yes, achieve their immediate benefits that are desired, but simultaneously also make advances in equity, resilience, and sustainability in our societies around the world? Essentially, how do we achieve co-benefits from everything that we're going to do that get us to our long-term goal and vision? Next slide. Now, in the research roadmap, what we've done is those top 25 research priorities are all framed as a question. There is further elaboration in the research roadmap. There's contextual context. There's sub-questions that are further identified to help a better understanding of this, as well as conveying the full opportunity. So I'll ask you to go through the next slide as well. And then the slide after that, these are just highlighting those different research priorities. Next slide, which I encourage folks to take a look at in the research roadmap as appropriate. Next slide. And one more. So as I mentioned, the unifying question among the 25 is really about how do we achieve those co-benefits. And another way of framing it is, how do we achieve not just the bottom line, but how do we actually achieve a quadruple bottom line? And by that, I mean, how do we ensure that interventions and solutions, yes, achieve their direct benefits, but even better if they can achieve one co-benefit, even better if they can achieve two co-benefits, even better if they can achieve three co-benefits for that quadruple bottom line. We need science that's going to guide these kind of solutions because we don't fully know how to do it in all contexts. Next slide. And of course, we actually need all three of these dimensions of equity, resilience, and sustainability. And this figure in the slide is really intended to impart that where if we have a recovery that's, let's say, more equitable and even more sustainable, if it's not more resilient too, we might find ourselves facing another future threat for which our systems are not designed to address. And so we really do need all three. We need to make sure our societies and systems are fair. We need to make sure that our societies and systems have long-term view and that they'll still be there generations to come, and that those systems and societies are ready for the numerous and seemingly increasing number of risks and threats that they face. Next slide. Ultimately, though, if science is going to inform that kind of recovery and inform quadruple bottom line efforts, we need to make sure that our scientific systems are robust themselves. Next slide. And so what the research roadmap does is it highlights 5 science strategies for better recovery. These are strategies that are important for all societies because, of course, all societies need to be able to leverage the power of research and science in order to inform policies and actions and programs and various efforts. The first science strategy we highlight is data, and not just the data itself, but of course, all the infrastructure, the organizations, the policies, the processes, the systems for its oversight and protection. Those systems are going to be critical because we know that data-driven efforts are going to be more impactful than efforts that don't have the benefit of data. Second is implementation science. This is the study of methods and strategies to promote the uptake of effective interventions. And that's important because very often we actually have interventions that work. And we know, for example, through either randomized controlled trials or rigorous other evaluations, that these interventions work, but they actually don't necessarily work in all contexts. And they often have to be adapted in light of various circumstances, whether it's social, ethical, economic, or political feasibility. And as a result, we need a science of implementation. And so this budding area of research is essential because not only is it enough to do science of what works, we also need the science of what works in what context, for which populations, in what ways. Third is rapid learning systems. Just like this whole UN Research Roadmap recovery effort was very much intended to spur a rapid learning initiative, we need to better design systems in all societies, agencies, and programs to make sure that we're able to learn more quickly. We shouldn't have to wait 10 years after an initiative has been fully implemented to see whether it's had any effects, or indeed to learn whether we should have done it differently. Fourth, we need greater attention and efforts for knowledge mobilization to ensure that research and knowledge is not only generated, but actually used in practice and policy. And fifth, we need a science of science. And of course, this isn't new, but too often those responsible for science systems, whether it's research funders or those who are working within research institutions, don't sufficiently bring a scientific lens on their own practices and policies. And so that what's clear is that if we want science to be taken up in COVID-19 recovery policies, we need to also make sure that we're bringing that scientific lens to science itself and how science can contribute to recovery and the myriad of other goals that we try to achieve. Next slide. So with that, I'll just highlight that ultimately this research roadmap is intended to catalyze action from several different stakeholder groups. Of course, researchers are needed around the world to tackle the complex research priorities that were identified, and ultimately to make use of that new knowledge to inform the kind of transformative changes that are needed to get us on track to a better recovery and get us on track to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Research funding agencies need to work together in order to ensure that there's sufficient and coordinated investment to address these research priorities. And governments and civil society, businesses and other partners need to act and demand this kind of research from the research systems. And then once it's generated, they need to make use of it in order to inform their own recovery efforts and ensure that they're actually institutionalizing the use of research evidence in their own decision-making. Next slide. And with that, I just wanted to highlight just the next steps. One that I'm very excited about is this Friday, January 29th, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations will be meeting with the heads of research funding agencies around the world, along with the International Science Council, to discuss the power of science for informing a better development, and a recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. That will be broadcast and publicly available on UN Web TV for anyone who's interested in joining. Second, of course, we're going to be disseminating the roadmap, including such as through the International Science Council, for which we're greatly appreciative. New partnerships are being developed between UN teams and national research funding agencies and research institutions. We're exploring new mechanisms for coordination around research for development and tracking progress on this roadmap's implementation. For a big thanks to GLOPADAR and the UK Collaborative for Research and Development, which has launched a funding tracker to see and measure resources against these 25 top-level priorities. So with that, next slide, I'll just thank everyone who participated in this process. Within the Government of Canada, while the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, we're very proud to have taken the lead. This really was an effort supported by all of our partners within Government of Canada. And this was an effort supported by 38 other research funding agencies from 25 other countries, numerous civil society organizations, including the International Science Council, and so many people around the world who gave their time and expertise in order to make this effort possible. So a big thank you, and I look forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for your excellent intervention there and taking us through the UN roadmap. I think, one of the things that struck me when you were talking was you said that the pandemic has provided the conditions for marginalisation. And that got me thinking about how do we ensure that science isn't marginalised? How do we ensure that through this process, all science is considered, that, and again, when you showed your 5 areas, and I'm thinking about data infrastructure, I already think some countries, don't have the level of data infrastructure that other countries have, or when we think of knowledge mobilization, and I think that highlights the need for strong systems. So I guess the first question is, how do we ensure that science is mobilized and is responding to not just the marginalization of populations and responses, but also the marginalization of science? How does the UN roadmap deal with that issue?
Well, I think that this roadmap is very much intended to be a marker for the power that science has in informing both immediate actions as well as over the long term. I think actually the fact that the UN Deputy Secretary General invited the development of this roadmap really highlights her visionary leadership in recognizing that during emergency contexts like a pandemic, there can be a bit of a tyranny of the urgent, in the sense that there is this urgent need to act right away. And of course, there is that urgent need, and we do need to act right away. But we also know that actions will be best if those urgent actions, those immediate responses, are informed by what we already know and if we have enough foresight to be thinking about not just what research and knowledge is needed to inform actions today, but what research and knowledge is needed to inform actions that are going to be needed to be taken next week, and 2 weeks from now, and next month, and next quarter, and indeed a year from now. Because of course, science can do a lot to inform actions that might be needed to be taken in a couple of hours, right? Where there are systematic reviews, provide a very important resource to very quickly get at what does the global evidence say. There's evidence briefs, issue briefs, and many different mechanisms. But science is best when it has some time to undertake more rigorous efforts. And so it's the extent that through efforts like the UN Research Roadmap, we can not only identify what those future research needs will be, but also lay down a marker that science is critical for every aspect of this response and its recovery. And that means we need to think about it. We need to support science. We need to fund science. We need to create spaces for science and science use to be institutionalized within policymaking processes. That's not easy, but this research roadmap is one attempt to lay down that marker and emphasize the importance of that and guide a way forward.
And observations come in from one of our participants that transformative changes need to be positive, that they can be positive and negative. And I know I have a particular view in my head what a transformative change or a transformative pathway that we often talk about around the COVID recovery looks like. But people have different views. So how do we make sure when we talk about transformative changes, we're talking about the transformative changes needed for equity and resilience and sustainability?
Yeah, I think that's a critical question. I think on the global level, we're quite lucky in the sense that we have a vision that was adopted and supported by essentially every country in the world, and that's the Sustainable Development Goals. And so when it comes to a transformative agenda, at the global level, we have quite an excellent transformative agenda. Of course, people can critique any agenda and will, and indeed in light of an event like COVID-19, I think it does call upon us to relook at that agenda and whether it is the right agenda at the right time. But in the meantime, it does provide a unifying framework for the world, which I think has been very effective. And so that level, we, in a sense, we know sort of where we want to get to. We don't fully know how to get there, and that's where the power of research needs to come into place. I think the other thing is that each society will, of course, have different values, different citizen preferences. And so this research roadmap was not designed as a prescription for each and every society. It was instead laid out as a framework to help societies think about priorities that would be most important for their own society, for it to be adapted, applied, and taken up in different ways. So there is no one size fits all when it comes to these kind of issues.
I think we've got time for one more question, if you can answer it quickly. I think this is a nice way to end this discussion and take us into the new breakout sessions. But do you think that the pandemic has shown the urgent need to recenter science and research for the benefit of humanity, and that the members of the United Nations and the scientific community have come together and really understood that? Have policymakers and the scientific community come together? Has there been a shift in thinking?
I think there has. I think 2020 was the year of the scientist, in the sense that what's been made very clear is that the only way out of this pandemic is science, and the only way to get a better recovery is science. And so to the extent that there's anyone in the world who didn't believe in the power of science or didn't think it was important or that it shouldn't be a top priority, I think 2020 was the year that showed them otherwise. And so building on that and building on the year of the scientist, it's now our responsibility, but also our opportunity to continue these conversations and make sure that when we do think of the future of development, when we think of the Sustainable Development Goals, we're thinking about, at the core, what can science do to get us there? Because without science, we're not going to get there.
Absolutely, and we must be living within planetary boundaries. And I think you're absolutely right. 2020 was the year of science, and when I consider seeing heads of state, addressing their citizens in response to the pandemic. Quite often the chief scientists were standing next to them. So I think it's been a really powerful year for science. And I hope it continues. So thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much for your
Thank
discussion
you.
today. I'm sorry if we didn't get to everyone's questions.